Today our topic is the subject of the unconscious. First of all, it is important to differentiate between, well, subject of Cartesian philosophy and the subject of science. Those are, in Lacanian terms, would be considered on the side of the other, on the side of the symbolic. Hence, they operate within formalized discourse or discourses, one of them actually, discourse of the university as such. And they don't really denote the unconscious truth, which is the subject of psychoanalytic study, isn't it? Subject of the unconscious, as per this study, is that which is constituted as a clash between being of jouissance and existence in language. As we have defined through the study of the drive, that initial discord at the level of the body, corporeality of the body, is what propels the process of subjective becoming. For every human individual, we are quite specific at that, since we are speaking beings of language. So, when the being of jouissance, that which is corporeal, hits the language, that which is incorporeal, something happens, yeah? Something is structurally excluded from here. And pushed outside, yeah. As we have noticed, that which has been pushed outside constitutes that which is extimate, intimately exterior to a subject, and that is where the locus of the real is, yeah. There are three types of structural exclusion, which you can delineate now. First of all, which being repression. Second will be disavowal. And the third, rejection, which constitutes respectively neurotic, perverted, and psychotic, with a subdivision of that, autistic as well, subjectivities. Depending on the mechanism of the structural exclusion, subjectivity is constructed, which we will look at individually when we look at each of these structures. For now, it is important to understand the general mechanism in which it happens, yeah. And post-Oedipal subject of the unconscious exists as the effect of signification, as an effect of language, yeah. However, corporeality of subject's being is still retained here in jouissance. And as we know, jouissance always persists despite being inscribed within language. We'll see how and why in a moment. This process of transition into language within neurotic subjectivity, and this is what we are going to focus primarily for now, is the neurotic subjectivity and the mechanism of repression, because it's where psychoanalysis has come from. It's where it started. Freud's formulation of repression has originated psychoanalysis. We'll see how it happens in a moment. Because repression has happened, something of this being of jouissance has been sacrificed. So it has been, to a certain extent, cut off, barred, cancelled out, in favor of accessing this language, and I should say culture as well. That which constitutes the other, this Lacanian other. This is the side of the real. So this process of sacrificing the corporeal being, the libidinal thrust of jouissance, in order to fit in language and culture, is what Lacan called castration, or Freud as well, but they formulate it in different way, or castration complex. Well, castration complex is a result of the of that. Castration complex is what accompanied by anxiety, because entering into the language will result in anxiety for this, for being on corporeal level. However, even being on corporeal level is already delineated by imaginary identifications, if you remember the lecture on the mirror stage. Because initial being of jouissance is so completely unsettling that there is no abiding there. It is bewildering. Hence, a subject acquires imaginary identity, and that already kinda structures this being into sense of wholeness. It is that creates jubilation and playfulness and sense of totality for an infant. However, going through Oedipal complex here, something of this totality and unity and jubilation, which comes through identification with the first other, have to be sacrificed via the triangulation, via separating quality of the third other, which results in castration complex and castration anxiety, and ultimately subjectivation, how do you call it? Subject is being introduced to language. Subject is being subjectivized by language. This corporeality is being overwritten by signifiers, which come from the other. Okay, so now let us look how exactly does it happen. So at the outset, dialectical tension between the symbolic existence, which is the other, and which is perceived as external phenomena, because language imposes from the outside, and being of jouissance, which is the subject non-divided. That is quite clear in the autistic subjectivity, by the way, when we'll look at that. Subject is non-divided there and fully naked, sort of, in front of the being of jouissance. This dialectical tension between external phenomena and the internal tension of being of jouissance results in subjective division. Subject is divided, yeah? A few things to understand about this process of subject formation on the level of the symbolic. The other is where the real of jouissance is imposed, and that the other has a primacy. What does it mean? Well, the other is already always there. The subject is already constituted under the primacy of the signifier. Why? Because the subject is born into the signifying realm. Already there is a family history, already there are words spoken even in utero. There is, of course, energetic influence upon what signifiers and with what affect are being uttered even when the subject is still in utero. So the signifier does have a primacy. There is no such thing that we come into this world as a tabula rasa. Nah. We come as inscribed. And if you take into account karma and sustained action in previous generation, which is transmigrating, yes, it has also been inscribed through signifying primariness. Yet, the subject always already only partially incorporated into the language of the other. Partial incorporation. Because, as we have seen before in the theory of the drive, the language can never fully capture the drive. Instead, the drive actually as well divides the other. Division on the subjective level, in turn, divides the language and the culture, which gives rise to infamous A, object A or tre, that element which is within the otherness of the real being and which is within the real being of otherness. Remember this, if we take two circles, this here is object A. Well, this is of course a circle of the subject, this is of course circle of the other. And of course through that both of them are divided. Don't know why I'm so happy about it. So, division on the side of the other, which is the signifying chain, by the way. S1, S2, S3, etc. Division within the signifying chain, articulated in speech, is that which makes up the unconscious. The unconscious. Now, as it is seen from here, compatibility between the other and the subject is impossible. Only partial incorporation of jouissance possible. Unconscious is always already the discourse of the other, because signifiers incorporated are coming from the other. And this stream of signifiers persists outside volition. And that's important. That which has been repressed, whatever, rejected or disavowed, still persists, and a subject, or even this subject, has no conscious control over it. Certain subjects even identify with this, but we'll look at it later. The other is divided, it's lacking, it's unable to provide a medium by which the subject can fully articulate the drive, and hence object A arises. Object which is transitional between language and jouissance. The other is divided also in the sense that it doesn't provide a set of ultimate signifiers which can once and for all identify or name those three precarious areas of gender, sexual relationship, and authority. Yeah, this is a divided other and the hallmark of the divided other. Even the name of the father, the master signifier, is also that. It's also lacking, but neurotic doesn't quite see it. Even name of the father does not give sufficient consistency to the signifiers comprising the other as a result of the subjective division. Hence, what we do by spending most of our time systematizing phenomena, isn't it? Trying to give consistency to this inchoate mess. Hence, education is in demand precisely because of structural incapacity of symbolic to give consistency to the real. Now, all of this connotes with dukkha, obviously, in dhammic terms, and the fundamental dissatisfactoriness pertaining to existence. People often want to understand what is dukkha. Well, it can be understood in many levels. Buddha gave very concise and clear definitions, such as dukkha is that which pertains to old age, sickness, and death, pertains to getting what you want, pertains to getting what you don't want and getting what you don't want, as well as to sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair, as well as the fact that all of that beloved and pleasing will be separated from me, either through the cessation of the object giving pleasure or the cessation of a subject which derives pleasure from that due to old age, sickness, and death. However, we can look at the dukkha in a different light a little bit, using this modality of psychoanalytic theory. So we can say that dukkha, maybe I'll write dukkha, good old dukkha. Dukkha pertains to the being of jouissance. In what way? Well, being of jouissance is thwarting and subverting. It's the inchoate pressure of the drive, isn't it? It's this initial lack of being expressed in Exposition. The quarter of displeasure which is being initially expelled during the primal repression. And this always creates the sense of incompleteness on the sort of a deep intrapsychic level, the sense of lack. Even if the lack is not seen due to one's subjective structure, if it's psychotic or perverted, it will still be perceived deep within, because at the level of primal repression there has already been expulsion of the certain quarter of this real being. Anxiety arises as a result of this. Once facing up to this incompleteness of the expelled, one experiences anxiety, and that of course pertains to dukkha and dissatisfactoriness pertaining to things. That's at the level of the real, isn't it? At the level of the imaginary, we have imaginary totality. Why is this dissatisfactory? Well, precisely because of its fragility. The sense of totality taken through alienation in the other is always extremely fragile. Psychotic subjectivity illustrates it very well. Encounter with phenomena which don't support that sense of totality cause it to break down. Yeah? Encounter with the phenomena of trauma causes imaginary totality to break down immediately. Yeah? And if the subject does not have more robust crutches to prop oneself with, such as in the theory or symbolic understanding of phenomena or in the practice, well, breakdown will occur here, yeah, as a neurotic breakdown or psychotic breakdown. Fragility and reliance on the other. Having to rely on the other all the time pertains to dependency, isn't it? And that's dissatisfactory. On the level of the symbolic existence, By existence and the whole question of existentialists, Jean-Paul Sartre and so forth, is rooted here, that the real being is taken away by symbolic existence. Symbolic existence is relied upon too much. Of course, there is no ability or no structural possibility to find any life in the symbolic, because it's ultimately that. It's the order of meaningless, essentially signifiers, which signify nothing if they're divorced from the chain of meaning at the level of imaginary which supports it. And if that symbolic existence is divorced from the quarter of jouissance, it's ultimately just empty chatter. And I guess the existential predicament is precisely facing up to that emptiness. And that's dukkha. Yeah. Well, absence of standard to measure. Phenomena of sexuality, gender, and authority against. Within the symbolic, causes dukkha, causes this ambiguity. Absence of complete symbolization is dissatisfactory. Any theoretician will vouchsafe for that. And repetition of symbolic articulation is dissatisfactory as well, because in order to maintain the subjectivity, repetition is okay, too many letters in one word. Repetition engenders neurotic structure ultimately, and the repetition of the circuit of the drive, which then passes through language, gets rendered via symbolic interpretation, whatever, engenders repetition. But yet repetition also circles through the modality of four discourses, which are ultimately closed systems where discourse circulates without really creating anything new, unless one takes and intersects a couple discourses together, which is what we're trying to do here. So neither real being, nor imaginary totality, nor symbolic existence, as per processes of rendering the drive via desire, along the chain of signifiers, are really permanent. They're all devoid of permanency. Here, what's gonna break up permanency? Physical death. Physical death. At the level of imaginary, what's gonna break up permanency? Personality breakdown. Again, either neurotic or psychotic breakdown vouchsafes for lack of permanency at this level of identification. Here, it's subjective destitution. Subjective destitution, which is something that can occur when a subject actually engages in the activity of serious dedicated processing and analysis. This is a result of psychoanalysis, isn't it? At least within Lacanian key. Psychoanalysis leads to this. Or any other form of analysis, really. Analysis as per dhammic analysis, dhamma vichaya, analysis of internal qualities, ruthless self-scrutiny. That's what it is really, which leads to undermining and then unbinding all of one's motivations. So that can be kind of self-made without the actual activity of research. Go do a PhD, you know what it is, what subjective destitution is. Every one of your assumptions, of your theories, of your prospects, and your views and opinions and statements will be put into question. And will be brutally scrutinized, and that leads to subjective destitution. Thereby one abandons all one's biases, preferences, and assumptions and starts thinking structurally. That's ultimately what it is. But that's also a glimpse of what we say anicca, impermanence. Yeah. All of this is devoid of abiding entity and has no basis of self-nature, which is another famous term, anatta. Anicca and anatta, which obviously are both dukkha. Impermanence, ownerlessness, and dissatisfactoriness of phenomena. And that's only dukkha which is structurally always already there. On top of that, there is an extra level of dukkha, well, due to meanness of human beings. And let's look at that level of dukkha now. This level of dukkha arises due to this process of symbolic rendering of real being via the otherness. The discourse of the other is always already plagued by discursive elements which are subversive to both the imaginary totality and to the symbolic existence. These are other signifiers which are incorporated in hostile, depreciating, self-annulling way or manner, as opposed to appreciative signifiers which a subject incorporates at the level of ideal ego. Remember mirror stage? Through witnessing, response, encouragement, and validation of the other. These are obviously appreciative ways of responding. There can be as well depreciating, hostile, and reproachful ways of responding to the demand of the nascent subject, which do not support one's ideal ego. These signifiers precisely denote the real of dukkha, which pertains to what we call the 5 hindrances. And these are elements which are also known as kilesa. Kilesa, mental defilements, meanness, hostility, depreciation, whatever, greed, hatred, and delusion. They are moha, dosa, lobha. Greed, hatred, and delusion. Shortly, for all of these. What incorporation of these signifiers give to the subject? Sense of abandonment. No. Sense of abandonment, non-acceptance, self-annihilation, isn't it? Annihilation, even evisceration. Remember, we are talking about the level of at the level of the drive. We are talking about the body, which is pervaded already by inchoate intensities, but when on top of that is overlaid depreciating signification pertaining to greed, hatred, and delusion, ill will of 5 hindrances, sensuality, doubt, restlessness, remorse, lethargic oblivion, and doubt. All of that gonna further decline the already inchoately unstable continuity on the level of the drive. And well, of course, this gonna cancel out the imaginary totality, which is problematic because this is the base level of identification for any subject. If that is cancelled out, well, what results is our infamous actual pathology or trauma. There is already structural trauma at the outset of subjectivity. The very being of jouissance is a structural trauma. But what worsens, makes this trauma worse, is precisely signification laden with kilesa, with mental defilement. This is one level: hostility, depreciation, annihilation, annulling of the other as a subject, annulling of the other's being. Hatred primarily, really. Hatred, ill will. Another manner is in a demanding and imposing manner. Inscription of signifiers can occur in this manner as well. And these elements, of course, will lay foundation for superego, which is going to be punishing instance of the egoic structure. Remember, ideal ego incorporated from initial other, ego ideal incorporated from the second other and the big other, and the superego is precisely denoting the demand and imposition of certain ways of symbolization, which want to condition certain ways of being as well, from the other, constitute superego. This is how you must behave in the eyes of the other. Through this, familial complexes are transmitted. Familial complexes, as well as the repressed contents of whatever parents are carrying. Parents repressed or rejected if the parents are psychotic. And of course it bears on the jouissance of the other, yeah, which makes a subject into an object. How do you say it? Into the object of the other's enjoyment. Bears on jouissance. Controlling or demanding parents want to make the child into their object, yeah, make them the imaginary phallus so that they can derive enjoyment from the child. And this is why at the level of, I don't know, training of the mind, or the level of even psychoanalysis or therapy, one examines these areas whereby signification been inscribed on one in this manner and disidentifies from it. So a kind of sorting out, filtering needs to be done. That which has been incorporated, the goodness which has been incorporated from the other, needs to be left. And the meanness, the evilness, the kilesa, the demand, the imposition, which may have been done out of ignorance and craving, needs to be abandoned. And without knowing it or not, certain signifiers can be transmitted in ambiguous manner. Ambiguous manner. And this is a level which even well-meaning parents really cannot avoid. This bears on the lack in the other, because the other is lacking due to inability to circumscribe the drive, as well as on ignorance. Avidya, the very first stage of dependent origination. If you use dhammic terms, initially there is ignorance, yeah, the ignorance was there prior to the parents, the ignorance remains there in the parents, there's the ignorance there in the descendants, the ignorance is transmitted from parents to the descendants, unless parents practice the Dharma and try to work somehow through the ignorance. This also bears on the inability to produce definitive answer to dukkha. Basically, not knowing dukkha, or not knowing the first noble truth about dukkha, that there is dukkha. People who deny that, obviously, who have psychotic or perverted structure, will have that layer of ignorance. Of course, there is a baseline of ignorance as such, which pertains to not being enlightened ultimately. Unless one is fully enlightened, then there is no ignorance. But whilst one still is deluded and not enlightened, there is ignorance, of course. And that's there, obviously, as a bottom line for everything. Inability to provide any coherent method of practice, which may lead one to work through the ignorance, is also at this level. Like a child usually is curious, isn't it? And they ask questions. They want to know how to deal with shit. But when the method is not given to them, either through education or through parenting, well, that contributes to that level of ambiguity at the level of inscription of signification. That creates a level of dukkha on its own. All of it kind of imposes ignorance upon the subject. So this is the, in a nutshell, ways in which unwholesome, one might say, signification is imposed, inscribed upon a subject. Now, let us look at the structure of subjectivity in topological terms a little bit. The way unconscious functions or being inscribed is best illustrated with the Möbius strip, which is something I wanted to show you in the lecture on the drive, but I didn't have a strip. Now I have. So if you take a piece of paper, twist it on both sides, like so, 180, then we connect the sides, like so, and I shall glue them together. We get ourselves a Möbius strip. Except it doesn't want to glue, but okay, I'll hold it for now. As you can see on the drawing, the surface of the Möbius strip is such that it becomes its interiority. So the exteriority, if we trace it, gradually turns into the interiority, and if we keep going along the side of interiority, we come back to the exteriority once more. Which is what we have here. I don't know, maybe we'll stick it up somehow in here. Doesn't want to. That's it. The Möbius strip, a symbol of the unconscious. It's a topological figure ultimately. So what we have here is the process on which the unconscious is constituted. Let's maybe articulate it with stages, yeah. First, the initial inscription. We have here a signifier, whether it's depreciating, annulling, self-annulling, or supporting and affirming, is taken from the field of the other. Signifier is taken in. Then what we have? Signifier is repressed. In case if it is traumatic, annulling as well. Signifier is repressed. Then, what has been separated from this signifier is the affect. Is withheld. In the body. Affect is withheld in the body. What is affect? It is the response of corporeality to this particular signifier, because with signifier from the other comes other's desire, or other's demand, or other's violence and hate, or other's love as well, and appreciation, and teaching, and enlightening guidance. All of this can come from the other, do come from the other. We don't procure them ourselves. Remember, it's the primacy of the other as the locus through which we constitute ourselves, through the hindsight of the other. So all the signifiers come from there. And with them they carry along the quota of affectivity, whether it's demand and desire, or violent, or neutral and detached and enlightened, or whatever. This affectivity is withheld in the body. That affectivity which is wholesome and supporting that initial imaginary identification becomes incorporated as the wholesome affectivity, as the wholesome qualities that the subject may have. Appreciation, presence, sense of being loved, sense of self-worthiness. Whereas depreciating signifiers are taken in and repressed, and their affect is that of, well, depreciation and self-worthlessness and disturbance and sense of abandonment and anxiety pertaining to death and pertaining to non-existence. This affectivity is withheld in the body. How is withheld? Well, this here we have to talk about chi and the process of energetic exchanges in the body. Basically, the affectivity pertaining to chi is withheld in the frequency of information that body is vibrating under, if you like, if you're into this kind of terminology. But electromagnetic fields, biomagnetic fields are not a alien thing even to scientific discourse. So chi as a vibrational information structures the body. This is, well, my explanation of how materiality of language is unfolding in the body. Lacanians would have their own explanation. To me, this seems quite tenable because I have direct experience how chi is and how it structures the body. So chi again carries along with it the information which has been transmitted qua signifiers, which has been inscribed. Then chi, when interacts with the body, because what chi is the extension of the mind, right? Signifiers are first incorporated through the cognitive aspects, through the mind and language itself. Then, when it is qua chi transmitted to the body, it structures the body, and affectivity is retained in the body, whereas the signifier itself, which may have started all, is repressed. And where does it repress to? Into the interior of the Möbius strip. Here, yes, see, if here it enters the signifier, it then travels until it is here, no longer seen on the dark side of the strip. But because strip is all connected, it can make a whole circle and come back again onto the exterior. And this is basically the process of, well, many processes can be. Psychoanalysis is one of the processes. Trance is another process. People in the state of trance can manifest the unconscious conscious. Hypnosis, intoxication, which is a form of trance as well, can produce this exchange between the conscious and unconscious, whereby the subjective division is overcome, it is erased, so the information travels freely. When, again, along this process, this repressed signifier resurfaces, the affectivity which pertains to it is mobilized, doesn't it? And when it is mobilized, it can be abreacted. How? Well, many ways. Either it's linguistically, or purely through the organism's functioning, or through actions, through movement, through dance, through martial arts, through exercise, many ways. So this is how conscious and unconscious continuously intertwine, interchange, interdepend. Again, with a neurotic subjectivity. Second, we would say, again, I guess, subsequent inscription. Because signifier being dislodged in the unconscious is not the end of the story. What happens then is that signifiers enters into relationship with other repressed signifiers. In relationship with other signifiers. Within this subterranean flow of unconscious signifiers, relationship that they form are I like language, basically. It's a linguistic relationship of the signifiers within language. Again, as I have mentioned before, signifier doesn't necessarily mean anything. It's just a unit acoustic image. It is only known contextually. And this is where the contextuality comes from. Having entered into the relationship with other signifiers, repressed into the unconscious, dark side of the Möbius strip, it enters into relationship with other signifiers and forms this sort of subterranean discourse, which meaning can only be constructed retroactively. So see, even if the traumatic event has occurred and the signifiers which have been annulling a subject's very being have been incorporated and repressed, it is not necessarily that it will produce the trauma, because the meaning which is produced is only constructed retroactively. First, the signifier has to enter the relationship with other signifiers. And then when, through memory regression, one enters this sort of a cobweb which signifiers have formed inside the unconscious, this has potential to generate meaning. And depending on the subject's stance towards this meaning, basically the subject's as the ideal ego vis-a-vis this meaning, whether it's supporting the ideal ego or destroying or rupturing or rejecting the ideal ego, that will determine whether trauma has happened or not. First of all, traumatic event is just, well, the real, yeah? The real has to be symbolized for it not to be traumatic. However, if a subject has a certain degree of endurance and strong resolve within, which is based partially on the imaginary identity and the security of attachment which one has been exposed to, and partially on innate virtues, I would say, because certain subjects come into this world with virtues already there, already innate in them. Depending on those innate virtues, the subject may experience the eruption of the real not as traumatic, but as such. However, having retroactively perceived the phenomena as traumatic in relationship to the imaginary totality pertaining to the ego, one can be said to have acquired trauma if it has disrupted the totality of the ego, and if there was no adequate symbolic processing and detour through the other in order to abreact this experience. So, however, if the phenomenon is perceived as traumatic, that results in the intrapsychic discord. And because virtually everyone experiences some degree of the real which cannot be abreacted or symbolized, and which disrupts the imaginary totality, not a single one is completely free from intrapsychic discord. Hence we say within the psychoanalytic theory that there is no normality as such. There is only structuration, which is either autistic, perverse, psychotic, or neurotic. The most normal one can get, at least in an analytic way, is having gone through the analysis. Well, there are other ways as well. Well, what happens then? The intrapsychic discord mobilizes new signifying material. How so? Well, because it needs to be processed. Internal pressure, which comes now not necessarily from the drive itself, but from the signifiers which have entered into the relationship within the unconscious. This produces discord as well. And this is particularly, like I said, the bread and butter of psychoanalysis, this level of dukkha, the intrapsychic discord, psychopathology, as opposed to actual pathology, which happens at the level of the drive and the real. Psychopathology, which happens here. This here is psychopathology. Nee. That's a one word. Jesus, so many letters. Psychopathology happens here, at the level of unconscious discourse. Why? Because intrapsychic discord continuously produces more discursive material. That material again travels along the interior, from exterior to interior. It surfaces due to discord, then travels back in, producing more of the unconscious and dislodging more signifying material into the unconscious, which enter a new relationship with the material already repressed in there, which produce rich and fundamentally disruptive psychic life, which produces dreams, which produces symptoms, and this is what people go to analysts with. Well, neurotic people in this case. All of this results in the unconscious as discourse of the other. The unconscious as discourse of the other. Why? Because new signifying material always comes from the other. It is the other that one reaches out for processing, and it is the other's signifiers as discourse is being dislodged, repressed into the unconscious. Unconscious is now one's own. It is the discourse purely taken from the other. Well, of course, it has been shaped in a very peculiar way, which is not at all common with how it is shaped into that next door neighbor of yours, or how it is articulated in theory or in scientific discourse. Not at all. It's very peculiar. That's what makes the dream analysis so interesting within the psychoanalytic context, but it's only that. It's just interesting. Curiously, surfacing of unconscious material stops for people who have attained complete mindfulness, mahasati, mindfulness at all times, meaning that the presence of mindfulness eventually cuts out the proliferation of discourse. Hence, there is nothing that is dislodged anymore into the unconscious, and that which has been surfacing has surfaced and ceased. Because there is mindfulness and stillness of mind, there is no longer discord arises, but at that level we can say that the drive's pressure is also has been overcome, or well, it still persists, but the subject no longer reacts to it by creating one's own subjectivity, basically. Because what is subjectivity? Well, it is a response to the pressure of the drive. Let us see as to what happens as a result of the subject of unconscious coming into being, or what precludes the subject of unconscious coming into being, or what is subject of unconscious coming into being. Well, as we have already said, affects persist in the body. Which is reflected first of all on sexuality. It is the sexuality that sort of the most tender, the most tangible for a subject area, the libidinal body. When the affectivity, which is particularly disruptive, arises, it first of all affects sexuality. Then it affects physiological functioning, No, sorry, the order is a bit off. Psychic functioning. So what is affectivity? You can think of affectivity again as happening in the loop. Affectivity persisting into the body eventually is processed somehow, or causes processing to happen, and it sort of dives down into the subterranean flow of the unconscious discourse. At this point, affectivity has disappeared, maybe, but then when the resurfacing of this unconscious material occurs, because it all still retained in the physicality, in the energetics, in the channels, it will resurface again, produce more unconscious material, and that is in itself something that affects psychic functioning. Then ultimately, after the physiological functioning is affected as well. If the affectivity is obstructive, it will take a toll on the channels, cause blockages, which, when things don't flow in the body, will take a toll on the physiological functioning, on the health of the organs and the tissues, the process of metabolic exchange within the body, etc. Creating a peculiar way of being healthy for each subject. Affects persists. The other discourse persists as well. The other discourse persists as, let's now categorize it, neurotic way. Slips of the tongue. Garbled speech. Dreams. Symptoms. Complaints and demands. That's the neurotic way. Then what we have? Psychotic way. as hallucinations. And delusions. Hallucinations and delusions. Persecutory narrative, which can also delusion, but it makes sense to articulate as well. And then we have symbolic becoming real in case of schizophrenic, psychotic. Perverted way. It manifests as a split. And we'll talk about it in more detail when we look at the psychotic or perverted subjectivity. It's a split, which is not the split on conscious and unconscious. Here, unconscious is perceived as completely alienated from oneself, as the other. So the lack in perverted is situated on the side of the other entirely. Pervert perceive oneself as devoid of lack. We'll look at it again. And that's interesting. Autistic way. In autistic way, there is no persistence of the other's discourse. Why? Because the autistic subject has evacuated the other out of the equation of subjectivity. Since the language of the other is refused at the outset in order to process the drive is processed by different means with an autistic subjectivity, which we'll look at in detail. But here it's important to see that there is no other discourse that persists in a sense of chain of signifiers and the unconscious articulating itself. Very well. Again, primarily regarding the neurotic way. We can speak about organization of signifying material around the lack of being, because being hasn't accidentally been expelled at the very beginning as a primal repression. Lack of being. Signification. Result. Advent of the subject. The subject of the unconscious. And in this case, the neurotic subject goes on to formulate one's desire in chain of signifiers. Chain of signifiers. It is the sliding of the chain of signifiers, which is the neurotic's mode of being, if one can say so. We look in detail how the hysteric and obsessive neurotics articulate themselves as desire in a chain of signifiers. But basically, neurotic identifies with the other's desire, as opposed to psychotic, who identify with others' demand, as well as the perverted. And autistic doesn't identify with anything in the field of the other, apart from that which they then choose themselves. However, within the chain of signifiers, neurotic being takes place. And in the next lecture, we'll look at the objet attra, the object cause of desire, which will make it more clear how the it is that being persists within the signification, within the chain of signifiers. For now, it's worth discerning or differentiating that at this level of the being and the chain of signifiers, one can locate the truth. This is where subjective truth is located. And this is the truth that analysis bears on. This is the position where psychoanalysis situates oneself, in the position of the object cause of desire, the position of subjective truth, in order to bring about the subject's desire, in case that this subject is neurotic again. In analysis of psychotics, perverse, and autists, there is a different strategy altogether. In here, we talk about subjective truth, which we want to bring about at the level of the unconscious knowledge. Unconscious knowledge, which again is utterly different from discursive knowledge, Cartesian subject knowledge, or knowledge of science. Now, subjective truth, to take out the colloquials, is not that which something which someone may feel, okay, that feels right to me, that's my truth. No, that's still at the level of egoic functioning. Yeah, that's not the level of subjective truth, at the level of unconscious knowledge. What something can feel and consciously process is still pertains to imaginary relation, pertains to ideal ego. Simply because consciously articulated and understood through feeling sense. It's not deep enough, so to speak. It's not yet articulating as resonance, as thwarting and subverting content, because that always carries along with the element of thrill and horror a little bit. Because it bears down on the real of the drive and the real of self-annulling signifying material pertaining to the inside of the unconscious, inside of the Möbius strip. Let's see at the crucial characteristics of this knowledge. It is not based in sameness, which again is a part and parcel of imaginary relation. Not imaginary. One always takes upon oneself along the measure, along the yardstick of the other. In the case of imaginary relations, one always looks at the same other, different, superior, inferior, hierarchical characteristics, etc. And that's the pitfall that analysts try to avoid in analysis, by not in any way identifying with the analysans, with their patients. Or if the analysans wants to identify with analysis, an analyst would simply not allow that to happen, won't endorse it, because that puts analysis at the level of imaginary, which only results in identification and perhaps strengthening of the ego, perhaps in castrating of the analyst through the symbolic operation of the analysant, which won't lead to anything but another imaginary identification. So unconscious knowledge is not based in that. It's also not based in theory. So it's not symbolic per se, even though it is constituted as a discourse of the other initially. But the truth which comes out of it is not the symbolic truth which one may find in a university, or having opened the book, or having attended a lecture, or whatever. It's something other. So what is it based on? Based in real being rendered qua language. Yeah, remember, yeah, the being, the real being here of jouissance rendered through language of the other. So it must first be accessed by sort of regressing into the unconscious material. In psychoanalytic practice is done through associations, through recollection of dreams, through picking out the first thing that comes to mind, through analyst's punctuations and interpretations, through analyst's desire, which points in directly into subject's real being. So that's how gradually the unconscious truth is dug out, is gradually how it surfaces. And that inevitably carries along with it the quota of the reality of libidinal thrust. Always it, which is how that psychoanalytic practice frees out the libido and the neurotic, which has been repressed by signifying production or a predominance of the conscious knowledge over the unconscious knowledge, because the conscious knowledge, even based on theory or in others' demands, stifles out the real enjoyment that pertains to others' drive. And the free speech, in case of psychoanalytic talk and cure, helps to unbind this, helps to unbind the effect and reintegrate it into the libidinal continuity. But however, here we're looking further into what may follow, because psychoanalysis doesn't really care about what follows. What it wants to is to free up the stifled drive, bring a life again to the fore of subject's being. But then what else can be done with it is not that concerned. When one trains to be analyst, one's whole assumptions, all of one's fantasy is revisited, played alongside that real being of oneself in order to sort of train into a subject that capacity not to identify at all with the story, with the fantasy, with the chain of signifiers, but continually draw on that real being within themselves so that they can help others. But what I am interested in here, and that's why I'm putting this out, is what else can be done, right? Where else this real being, this energy, this life can be taken to. So spiritual practice come along this way. The unconscious truth must be understood or taken into hindsight of the teachings of the tradition. Must be accessed alongside teachings of traditions. Whatever tradition one takes up, in order to take one towards the unification with the ultimate. This is so that, well, a particular way of applying this desire that has been liberated from the symptomatic enveloping, so that this desire can be directed in a particular way in order to access the results of the spiritual practice or the cultivation. And here we have unconscious truth must be shaped alongside desire of the tradition, or desire of those who have formulated the tradition. Now, this can be problematic for those of you who actually are familiar with psychoanalysis, because in psychoanalysis we are striving to abandon all the identification with others' demand, and here demand of particular method of the spiritual practice can be mistaken for actual imposing demand on the superegoic level or the level of others' jouissance, which can be the case, which can happen if the spiritual teacher who distributes the teachings has not sorted out through one's own drive, have not purified their character, have not purified their energy body. Then the teachings that they disseminate will impose demand, which will be of the same level as the demand of the other and imposition of the other. However, if they did genuinely go through the process of training, their teachings that they disseminate will be as the quality of that, as just the truth. Something that we know in Buddhism as Dhamma. And Dhamma is impersonal. Doesn't carry demand, but arouses desire. Or directs desire towards the practice. This is what I'm particularly interested in arousing desire for the practice, which leads to complete liberation and complete congruency, peace and freedom, capacity to exist, well, not exist, capacity to be, regardless of the drive's pressure, capacity to be at peace and enter the states of being which are exalted, which are supramundane as opposed to mundane. However, to me, this process first must come to be, the unconscious truth must be accessed, and the vitality of the subject and the subject's desire must be brought forth. So, this is all it is for the unconscious subject, or the subject of the unconscious. Sorry for it being such a long lecture, but it's a lot about it. So, thank you.